As NHL teams prepare to open up the 18-19 season, we've had a lot of players on waivers here in the past few days, and I've had a lot of questions about how the waiver wire system works in the NHL. There still seems to be a lot of confusion and questions around it. So today I'm going to do a dedicated video explaining how the NHL waiver system works and discuss some of the current players that just went through the waiver wire. All that coming up next. Hey everyone, and welcome back to another video here at Top Shelf Hockey. If you're new to the channel, thanks for stopping by. We review and discuss all 31 NHL teams, so if you're a huge hockey fan, consider subscribing and clicking the bell so you don't miss anything. As I mentioned, we've been getting a lot of questions around NHL waivers and how it all works. Obviously, there's a lot of guys going through NHL waivers here recently as NHL teams kind of prepare their rosters for the upcoming 18-19 season. So as NHL teams go through their NHL training camps here and start to make roster cuts, which we've seen a lot of here in the past week, there's a lot of times players need to go through waivers to be assigned to their minor league affiliates, and there seems to be a lot of questions around what players need to go through waivers and which ones don't. So obviously I want to do a dedicated video here kind of explaining how this all works, and then we'll discuss some of the current players that just went through the waiver system. The big name on the NHL waiver wire yesterday got a lot of attention was Senators forward Zack Smith. Obviously they caught a lot of people by surprise, including Zack Smith himself, who was asked about it and was in complete shock basically. It looks as though the Senators were basically trying to get somebody to pick up his contract. We did find out here that Zack Smith cleared waivers today, that nobody picked him up. He has 3 years left on his contract with a fairly good cap hit considering how he's performed here in recent years. So obviously it was a case of the Senators trying to see if somebody would pick up his contract. Obviously they've had trade talks over the last year with a variety of teams, but they've yet to reach a deal to send him off to another club. Obviously it looks as though the Senators teammates of Zack Smith here weren't too pleased with this, and it kind of came as a big blow here as this team has been through so much lately that they weren't real pleased about how this all kind of went down. However, just because Zack Smith has cleared waivers, it doesn't automatically mean he has to be or will be sent to their AHL affiliate in Belleville. He certainly can remain on the NHL roster. There is no questions about that at all. But I know a lot of people automatically assumed he would either be picked up by another team or sent to the minors, which sometimes can be the case. Clearing waivers makes him eligible to go to the minors, but it doesn't mean that he has to. Let's get into the meat and potatoes of how NHL waivers work, because there's a lot of players that don't need them and some who do. And let's go through the eligibility here and how the NHL determines when a player is waiver exempt or waiver eligible. Now, because of the nature of how some of the positions in the NHL are different, goaltenders are treated with a different set of rules as compared to skaters. So defense and forwards have one set of rules, while the rules for goalies are slightly different. Now, I'm going to put up a graphic here on the full screen, and we'll go through this graphic, which explains very well how exactly this works and who's eligible and who's exempt. So as you can see on the screen, if a player signs his entry-level contract at age 18, then he has to hit either 5 years in the NHL or 180 games, whichever happens first, before he would require waivers to be assigned to a minor league affiliate. Now, goaltenders, as I mentioned, are treated differently. They are given more time, so either 6 years or 80 games. Since goaltenders don't usually play a full schedule like skaters do, I think it's only fair that they have different sets of rules here. So obviously, as you can see, if they signed their contract at age 19 or 20, the number of games they're required to play are the same, but the number of years that they're required to be in the league are also different. Obviously, it gets lower the later they are with their contracts. There's also been some confusion around how entry-level contracts work as well. The most common one is the 3-year contract, which players sign normally when they're 18 or 19 years old. However, you do see sometimes where it's a 1 or 2 year entry-level deal. The reason around that is that the requirement is based on their age. If they're between the ages of 18 to 21, then they get a 3-year contract. If they're 22 or 23 years old, they get a 2-year contract. And if they're 24, they get a 1-year contract. If they're 25 and up, the contract's not considered an entry-level deal. It's just considered a normal NHL contract. So if they sign their first deal at age 25 or older, and they do want to be assigned to a minor league affiliate, then they do require NHL waivers. So obviously this is a pretty good system. It works pretty well, but it can be a little bit confusing. So really at the end of the day here, really boils down to when they sign their first pro contract and how much experience they've either played in the NHL or how many years it's been since that contract has been signed. So now when you hear about an NHL player going on the waivers, how it works is the waiver system goes from noon Eastern from one day to the next. So it's a 24-hour period. So over that 24-hour period, while that player is on waivers, NHL teams have the option to put in a claim to try to claim that player off waivers. Now, if one team makes a claim and they're the only team, then they acquire that player. If more than one team puts in a claim to acquire that player, then it goes by whoever is lower in the standings. Now, how it works, where we're at the beginning of a new season here and the NHL hasn't begun the 18-19 season, they would base it off last year's standings, and that will apply throughout the first month of the season as well, up until November the 1st. So up until that point in time, if you see any players on waivers, they're going to base it off the 17-18 season standings. So whoever ranked lower in points and in standings at that time gets the player. Obviously, it's kind of designed to help teams that are struggling more pick up extra bodies to help improve the club. Now, another common misconception too is how one-way and two-way contracts work. I've heard some people comment and say, well, that player had a two-way contract, so therefore he shouldn't need waivers. Well, actually, the one-way or two-way contract doesn't actually impact whether or not the player is waiver exempt or waiver eligible. The only impact that one-way or two-way contract makes is what the player actually earns as a salary depending on where they play. Now, if they have a one-way contract, it doesn't matter if they play at the NHL team or in the minor leagues, they make the same salary. If they have a two-way contract, it just means that should the player be demoted to a minor league affiliate, that they can make a minor league salary, which is usually much significantly less here. So, for example, a player might make, say, $900,000 at the NHL, and they may only make $80,000 or $100,000, or even sometimes less at the American Hockey League level. So obviously that allows teams to demote players to the minors and not have to pay them nearly as much while they're down there. So oftentimes you will see players with two-way contracts, but depending on their other eligibility and the other criteria that we just went over, they would still require waivers to be demoted to the minor league affiliate. At one point in NHL history, players also needed what they called re-entry waivers. So they had to go through waivers to go down, and then when a team was ready to call them back up, they had to go through waivers again. With the last negotiation of the CBA, that part was done away with and that no longer exists. So a player only has to clear waivers one time, they get demoted down, they can be called back up without going through waivers again. So that in a nutshell is how the waiver system in the NHL works. Now, the most common reason for players to be put on waivers would be to be demoted to a minor league affiliate, or in some cases, like we saw with Zack Smith, the NHL club is just kind of hoping another team might take the contract off their hands. You'll see oftentimes where NHL teams are trying to trade a particular player, and if they're having too hard a time and taking too long, and they want to try any means necessary to get that contract off their books, well, this is a method of doing so. Another team might not want to trade for them, but they may be willing to pick them up off waivers where they don't have to give up another asset in return. Now, one other thing to clarify here as well is when a player is picked up off waivers, the team acquiring a player does have to pay the old club that they're coming from a transfer fee. The transfer fee does not count against the NHL salary cap. It's not viewed upon as that, but the team who's losing the player through waivers does receive a fee from the team that's acquiring the player. It's not very significant compared to what NHL players make. It ranges anywhere from like $20,000 to $60,000, and there is some other criteria in place based on the contract and value and things that determine that amount. But that's something that also does happen in behind the scenes that most people probably don't realize. So if a team puts a guy on waivers and another team claims him, not only does that contract get off the books, but they do get a cash incentive in return as well. But like I said, it's not anything too significant in comparison to NHL salaries, and it's something they really don't hear talked about in the media. Now, of course, besides being reassigned to a minor league affiliate or hoping another team picks up the contract, there is another set of waivers, which is unconditional waivers for the purpose of buyout or termination, which is a little bit of a different set of rules there. And that waiver wire window is a little bit longer. Instead of being on waivers for 24 hours, they can be up to 48 hours. And as you've seen, different NHL players over the years get their contracts bought out during the offseason, usually between June the 15th and June 30th. Teams do have a buyout window where they're allowed to do those types of moves. But so obviously, like for example, though, you see other cases like the Tampa Bay Lightning with Jake Dotchin, which is another little bit of a rule within the CBA a lot of people may not realize, is obviously if they feel there's a material breach in the contract, they can be put on unconditional waivers at that point in time as well for that purpose to have the contract terminated. It's not something you see very often. Probably around 80 to 90% of the time when you hear players on waivers, it's usually for a reassignment. Or in some cases, like you saw with Zack Smith, hoping that another club would take the contract off their hands. But you do see the odd time, obviously, for buyout, or in Dotson's case, a case of termination, which is pretty rare in the NHL these days. Now, just to go through some NHL players here that went through the waiver wire here in the past day or so. Obviously, I mentioned Zack Smith with Ottawa, which was a major surprise, but he did clear, so he's not going to be going anywhere. I dare say he's likely going to be very motivated to kind of shove that in Ottawa's face and show he can still play and produce to kind of earn more of his contract. And it wouldn't be completely surprising if at this point they did try to continue to trade him. It was speculated before that when Zack Smith was attempted to be traded that most other teams wanted a contract taken back off their roster too, that they weren't completely happy with as well. And obviously Ottawa did not want to do that. And obviously now putting him through waivers did not work as well to get another team to bite on his contract. So another option would be to attempt to trade him but offer to retain salary, which is something that I'll probably be surprised if they do, because we all know how cheap Eugene Melnyk is. And he's not going to want another contract on the books for somebody who's not playing there for 3 more years. So likely doesn't happen, but it is a strategy that they could potentially employ here. Especially if they can get something half decent back in return. But it's hard to really say if that's going to happen or not. Also, players clearing waivers here that require them is Montreal Canadiens forwards Hunter Shinkaruk and Michael McCarron. They've both been around long enough since they signed their original entry-level contracts that they now require waivers. Now, obviously, they both cleared as well and will report to the Habs AHL affiliate. But some other guys were sent down to the minors, like, for example, the Carolina Hurricanes sent down Jake Bean and Julien Gauthier, but of course, they're waiver exempt at this point. New Jersey Devils sent down forward Michael McLeod. A little bit of a surprise. I really thought McLeod would have a good shot at making the team this year. I also saw the Philadelphia Flyers demote defenseman Philippe Myers, which wasn't a complete shock. I did think there was a chance they might give him a go here early on, but not a complete shock. But all those guys don't need waivers because it hasn't been long enough since they signed their entry-level contracts, or they don't have enough NHL games under their belt. They don't meet either criteria there. So for now, they can go back and forth between the NHL and American Hockey League without any circumstance or risk of being claimed by other teams. So that, in a nutshell, is how NHL waivers work. If you do have any further questions about the NHL waiver system or other things around the CBA, feel free to leave me a comment down below in the comment section, and I'll do my best to explain it to you. And depending on what the topic is, I very well may do an extra video to kind of explain things to the rest of the viewers as well, depending on what questions come about from this. But if you ever have any questions around the CBA, waivers, or anything else, feel free to ask in the comments, and I'll certainly answer them. I'm not going to call myself a CBA expert by any means, but I think I do know it pretty well and can explain things here pretty well to you, should questions arise. If you're new to the channel here, hope you consider subscribing. We cover all 31 NHL teams. There's plenty of content here for all hockey fans to enjoy. So if you're new, hit that subscribe button. If you like this video, don't forget to hit the like button as well. I'd really appreciate it if you did. As always, thank you very much for watching, everybody. We will catch you next time.